Good afternoon and welcome to the latest Unleashing the Arc webinar. My name's Ben Lee, I'm Communications Manager at Bidwells and I'll be helping moderate the session today. We've got almost 400 people registered, so thank you very much indeed for joining us. Our panellists are just filing in now, so I will hand you over to our host for the next hour, our Head of Residential Development in the Eastern Region, Neil Kelly.
Excellent, thanks very much, Ben, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second in our three-part webinar series, Unleashing the Arc. Clearly the most important thing that's happening this lunchtime, apart from maybe a few words that Rishi Sunak might be making in about 40 minutes time, but we'll try and keep tabs on that as well. On the first webinar, my colleagues Rob Hopwood and Roland Bull looked at how the green infrastructure will be delivered across the Arc. Today, we're looking at how to best deliver development. How will the government lead the Arc vision and strike the right balance with policymakers at a local level to build at the pace required? We're really lucky to have many of the key players involved joining us today on the panel. It's our pleasure in introducing Kris Krasnowski, portfolio holder for the Oxford-Cambridgeshire Arc at MHCLG, and the man leading on the delivery of the Oxcam Arc vision on behalf of the government. Jeremy Long, chair of the Arc Local Enterprise Partnerships Group and chair of the Oxfordshire LEP. Bev Hindle, Executive Director of the Arc Leadership Group, which represents local authority leaders and LEPs across the region. And our very own Mike Derbyshire, Head of Planning at Bidwells, who's working on a number of major large-scale developments at both ends of the Arc and everything in between. You've already heard from my colleague Ben, who's going to be helping us behind the scenes in terms of some of the questions that are coming through. Finally, just thanks to Bridget Rosewell, Commissioner at the National Infrastructure Commission, who had hoped to be able to join us today, but unfortunately has had to pull out. The format for the session over the next hour is that you'll hear from Kris first, setting out where the government are for the first 10 to 15 minutes. And then we'd like to head straight into a panel debate and really encourage everyone listening in to try and get sort of questions submitted using the bar at the bottom. Also, keep a lookout halfway through the webinar. We're going to be holding a poll, looking at asking what the biggest impact on the long-term success of the Arc will be, in your opinion, and we'll come back to that at the end. So, looking forward to the session ahead. So, without any further ado, I'll hand over to you, Kris.
Thanks, Neil, and thanks for inviting us and hosting today. I want to start by sort of setting out kind of a few areas where the government is sort of focusing its efforts in the Arc, and then to talk a bit more about the Arc project in general. But let me start by saying there are a few places in the world with the economic assets, the institutions, the businesses, and the innovative capability and potential that we see here in the Arc, and we need to make sure that we maximise that. And yet, despite these assets and despite this kind of rich potential that we see, growth isn't quite where it ought to be. You know, notwithstanding kind of some of the issues around COVID and the impact that has had on the national economy, but even before then, you know, we think the kind of growth potential here is much greater than what's currently being delivered, and we're keen to kind of unlock that growth potential. And it sort of echoes the findings of the NIC work that was originally commissioned by the Treasury previously to kind of really look into this. And so we think we need to do more. And we think some of the things dragging back or dampening the growth potential is very much driven around the sort of infrastructure investment and sort of the deficit that's kind of grown over time as a series of sort of governments and actors haven't really invested at the scale that's needed to really unlock the growth here. And we think it's important that we act now, because if we don't, there's a risk that we don't maximise that potential, we don't maximise it for UK PLC, and we don't maximise it in a world where we're sort of competing much more internationally and globally as the years go on. And what we really want to kind of set is an ambition for growth in the corridor that isn't just driven by sort of GVA numbers or kind of how we deliver growth, but is actually kind of driven by making the Arc the premier global growth corridor internationally, and doing that by 2035, and at the very least getting there by 2050. So we think that's our kind of core remit and our ambition. And I wanted to kind of stress the importance of the economy as part of this project as the cornerstone driving our interest, and to sort of slay those myths around this only being about housing. This is very much an economic driven sort of narrative. We really want to maximise the growth potential, and we see the elements that contribute to that, including housing, but as well as others, as being key components. And I just wanted to also say that this growth doesn't need to be at the expense of the environment. And in fact, you know, the Prime Minister last week talked about the 10-point plan that we have for ensuring that growth is green and clean. We want to make sure that that is a kind of key feature and that we're pioneering that approach across the ARC. So I'll just quickly touch on kind of 3 areas to help in terms of what comes next. And the first is around the ARC project and what we would like it to be and where it will go in the future. The second is about collaboration and how we work with partners across government, but also at a local level and across institutions. And then thirdly, just to touch on some of those kind of areas where we'll make a bit of progress in driving our ambitions around a spatial framework and the way in which we want to work going forward. So I'll kick off by saying a bit about the ARC project. And I think when I've sort of interacted with projects like this in the past, sort of mega projects, I guess, with long time horizons, it's always been with an element of sort of ambition and sort of apprehension, really, because, you know, when projects have 30, 40-year time horizons, it's always kind of unclear how you can get there and what the delivery path for those should be. And I think what we've tried to do over the past couple of years since the NIC published their report and we responded in 2018 is to try and be patient and try and work up behind the scenes a kind of plan for how we can sort of develop a really kind of thought-provoking, ambitious set of proposals and then integrate them with our partners at a local level. And I think that's why you have perhaps seen less of what you might have expected from us in recent sort of months and weeks. But over time, we want to kind of make sure that changes. And the next 12 months will be huge for us as we kind of embark on a journey to kind of deliver some of the ambition that we have as we go forward. So on the ARC project itself, it's worth just kind of highlighting that this is a cross-Whitehall endeavour of the government, led from MHCLG as the kind of the portfolio holder, but in essence kind of bringing together key infrastructure departments, including the Treasury, including DFT, BEIS, DEFRA, DIT and others, to kind of really drive an integrated approach to how we think about growth in this area. And it's important that those kind of areas are understood and that each of the departments leading on those have kind of really clear ambitions and aspirations. And we have some projects that are already up and running. We have other projects that are in the pipeline, and we also know there are lots of ambitions that are coming through departments and from local places and institutions that really want to push a long-term agenda in this space. So it's important that we kind of acknowledge that, and our role in MHCLG is to really embed that place-based thinking and to really work with
Kris, you just need to unmute yourself again.
Sorry, I should be back now. Really want. Can I carry on?
Yeah, please do.
Yep. We really want to make sure that we focus on integration and maximizing the opportunities, and there are some really good examples in the way that we've been trying to work, thinking through how do we really unlock the opportunities around East West Rail as that comes forward, both from an environmental perspective but also from a house building and placemaking perspective, so that where new stations go we have a really good idea about how we can make working and living communities in and around those stations and opportunities. So for us, it's massively important that we do that. We've set up a kind of central team in MHCLG on behalf of the government to kind of lead a lot of this work, and that's supplemented by individual project teams in different departments. So this is a kind of one government approach to an economic project, and one that we're sort of quite proud that we're at the beginning of a journey with you and local partners on. Secondly, I wanted to talk a bit about collaboration, and in this is really about how we work together over the coming months and years, but also kind of how we've been working to date with local partners. And for us, there are kind of two really key components. One is we really need to talk to kind of like people and the communities that live and work in these places, and the businesses that kind of really help drive the growth that we've been seeing. And over the next kind of 12 months, we'll be embarking on a comprehensive plan to engage, consult and discuss the opportunities and the visions and aspirations of whole communities, businesses and institutions institutions in the area, and we want to make sure that we do that in a way where everyone can engage, despite kind of some of the impacts of COVID. We want to make sure that everyone has a voice, and that we do that sort of thoughtfully and sensitively to make sure that you're part of that discussion. And we'll do that as we sort of launch the spatial framework in January next year. The second is that we've been working really hard and hand in glove with kind of colleagues in LEPs and local authorities to really get to the bottom of kind of some of the appetite and aspirations that place leaders and civic leaders have in this area. And so we've embarked on a course of action. We've invested some small amounts of money to kind of help facilitate some of those discussions. And I'm sort of pleased that Bev's on the panel today. He can say a bit more about some of that work, but it's a key component of how we want to work going forward. And one where in the past government has either done things to places or devolved entirely budgets to places to kind of crack on their own. And here we're looking at a different model where we're trying to combine the best of all the component parts of the actors in the system so that we can actually collaborate and work together on kind of what comes next. And we think that's the way in which we can unlock the most potential here and really thrive in the future. And there's some really good examples of that working currently. And sort of this morning, I attended a really sort of insightful sort of governance group of the universities who have been developing some cross-arc regional collaborations on some major sort of infrastructure and innovation projects linked to kind of what comes next. And I think that there's some exciting times ahead, and perhaps we can talk a bit about those later. And then finally, I just wanted to say a bit about kind of where we go next. And in MHCLG, we own the portfolio for sort of housing, planning, and sort of elements of local growth. And for us, there's a kind of some key components here. So the first is very much around how we set that long-term plan and vision for the Oxcam arc and how we work with partners to develop that, but that we also make sure that we're utilising all of the appropriate evidence base and really making that accessible and transparent, and really engaging people and populations in some of the decisions and choices that we have as a society and in a place on what comes next. And we want to make sure that in doing so, we're utilising the digital agenda in a way that we haven't done before, and engaging with the academics that are leading the way in terms of thinking about how we can create new ways of making decisions strategically, using twins and using a lot of the evidence. And we want to sort of thank colleagues in Oxford and in Cambridge who have done some great work on some of this, and we want to integrate that as part of our work. So that's really important to us. The second is that we're also keen that we want to do this in a way that's sensitive to what comes next, and we want to make sure that what we're providing is both a blueprint for how growth will happen over time, and then also kind of segues into different components that we'll need to make sure are embedded as part of our approach, including on things such as the environment and environmental sustainability and how we deliver net zero, but also also around sort of joining up on the local industrial strategies that have all been brought forward previously and trying to maximise their potential, and going further in thinking about what a long-term infrastructure plan, investing in utilities and strategic transport will look like in places. And as part of that, we also want to make sure that sustainability is key to how we think and approach kind of work in the future. So we want to look at our cities and in the arc and look at ways in which we can maximise sustainable travel and transport as part of the options that we develop over time. And we want to use the opportunity of having such a lustrous series of departments around the table with us at senior levels in government to really then start to embrace the kind of the future investment in infrastructure in this area, and to meet some of those challenges that the NIC set the government back in 2017. And we want to make sure that we do that with you as partners, and we develop those areas both in terms of infrastructure, but also in terms of the softer sort of areas of innovation and research and capability that we can really bring forward and sort of do that as one. And then finally, we also want to use the whole range of tools that we have in the sort of government's kind of options in order to kind of make sure that we're doing this at pace and really unlocking the potential. For too long, we've kind of talked about doing things and trying to make them work, and it takes us far too long to do that. And I think one of the areas where we want to really sort of embark on a new journey is really thinking about commercial developments and how they interact with the planning system and ways in which we can maximise those, alongside thinking through the role of government vehicles and government collaboration with local partners to really drive some of those, such as through development corporations that we're thinking about in the context of East West Rail and other areas. So I'll sort of stop there, and I'm really keen to engage in the debate and the questions that you have, and look forward to the next sort of 50 or so minutes. Thanks.
Kris, thanks very much for that as a starter for 10. I thought that was really useful, and obviously sort of several key themes that are coming out and all of that. I think probably the one that sort of many of the people in the audience are probably really keen to try and better understand was that the commitment that government has to really engage with a wide range of stakeholders. And I think it's trying to set out how do you see this engagement sort of being held differently from what's gone before? How can the various landowners, developers, promoters that we've got on this call feed into the process? And so just to extend that question, it was interesting, David Rogers has just put a question in as to when will the 3.7 million people who live across the Arc be asked their opinion about all of these plans, public meetings, citizens' assemblies, chat bans. So I wondered if you could give us a sort of your initial thoughts on that, Kris.
Yeah, thanks, Neil, and yeah, of course. So we've been talking about this for a while, but what we really want to do is actually engage properly. And so we've done some work to date to understand some of the evidence that's out there on what might happen over time. But ultimately, we need to engage with real people. And so in January, we'll publish the process for how we will begin and embark on the journey of creating the spatial framework, which will be that long-term growth plan for the area. And we will kind of, through a series of phases, we'll look to kind of engage with kind of a whole range of communities, people and interest groups and sectors to really understand what they need. So that will set out in detail how that will happen in January. But the first phase will be very much around visioning and what the ambition for place will be that we'll want to bring together. The second phase towards the end of next year will be very much focused on some of those emerging findings and thinking through kind of what we think might be necessary, and doing that in a green style paper so we can also provide for ample time to consult on that process. And then later in 2022, we'll want to kind of really push the boundaries of those consultations, obviously kind of outline some of the findings and then take us to the next stage. And so we're keen to kind of do that. On the specifics about the particular development sector, I guess what we'd really like to do is to have some really in-depth sort of conversations with a whole range of groups. And we want to go further than perhaps we've ever done in a kind of in the planning system before, where we're having a really open, constructive dialogue with development companies and organisations in the sector to really understand what their needs will be, and not just over a kind of 5 or 10 year period, but looking out towards 2050 and beyond. And what are the things that will be required to really unlock the growth potential and unlock some of these kind of areas and sites that have kind of perhaps stalled or haven't quite got over the line. And so we want to kind of look at that. We want to look at ways in which we can make it simpler and easier and quicker to build out in the way that would kind of help here. But I want to kind of stress that we also think it's important that when we're talking about build and other areas, we also want to focus on the environmental sustainability of those developments. And we see the Arc as a pioneer in that regard. And so I don't want to leave anyone with any confusion that we will expect kind of the area to really embark on net zero as one of its key deliverables, and that will be a key feature as part of our project going forward. So I hope in January we'll kind of set out in a bit more detail how we plan to engage, and I hope that the 3.7 million people that are in the Arc and those people that may want to come to the Arc in the future will be keen to engage in that process with us. And we will do that digitally, we will do that with meetings, and we'll do that over time consistently in the same way, so that people have an ample opportunity to provide their voice and thoughts into this so we can shape it together.
Okay, thanks, Kris. Mike, I'll come back to you in a minute, actually, just in terms of the response on behalf of the industry in terms of how they engage. But Jeremy, if I can just bring you in for a second, I mean, how do the local authorities, LEPs and universities plan to engage with government and industry around the framework? Actually, sort of Bev, maybe if I come to you first, then Jeremy, we've got a follow on for yourself. So Bev, you just unmute.
Somebody had to do it. Good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, I'm very pleased to be here. I'm Bev Hindle, Executive Director for the Arc Leadership Group. We represent the local authorities, the LEPs across the Arc, and have come together for several years now. But I have to say, really the momentum is just starting to build over the last 6 months, working very closely with Kris and his team, developing our economic prospectus, and starting to now actually have a narrative that we can start to share and engage with. And I think one of the real challenges for us is, I see several of the questions are relating to that, which is, can we broaden that engagement out to a wider group of stakeholders, indeed the whole of the public? I think that's one of the real challenges we've got to do. But the work I'm doing, the work that Jeremy and Kris are doing, we're doing together, is can we make more of this collaborative effort to make sure that we're bringing people along with us? And certainly that's the approach we're going to take as part of the spatial framework. We've just agreed some collaboration arrangements that we'd like the government to consider, where we have a small working group of local authority and LEP partners and university partners working closely with Kris's team on the spatial framework as much as we can, providing that two-way flow of communication, because I think it's going to be essential for the government team to be able to connect with real places as this spatial framework, which will impact real places, takes place. But also making sure that we have a plenary of all local planning authorities accessible to the government, and for the government to have access to make sure that we're having as much influence on that as possible. And I think that's really, really important, because this is our opportunity to positively shape this place. It is an economically led region. That is its significance, no question. But the opportunity to make sure that place is delivered and brought along with it, clean, green, inclusive growth is brought along with it, must be for all of us to be able to achieve that in the benefit of the longer term economic prospects of the region. So very, very excited about the opportunity for us to be able to influence that spatial framework and work with partners going forward. Thanks.
Dave. Just thinking about, just focusing on that economic aspect, and just bringing Jeremy in, how are you going to continue to try and promote the employment base to attract the jobs and the companies to the Arc? And what will the LEPs be doing in terms of engaging with businesses to ensure that you're representing the voice of local business in the economy?
Thanks, Neil, and good afternoon, everyone. I mean, let me just start by just quickly kind of explaining local enterprise partnership, what we are as organizations across the Arc. We are local. We're absolutely place-based. We're about bringing together local business people like myself with our local authority leaders, with leaders from our further education, higher education establishments. We're enterprise focused. That means all about the long-term prosperity of the regions that we represent. And partnership, because we can only ever do this by gaining a greater common understanding by working together. So when that's about how do we help business, or indeed how do we help government to help business, it's about gaining a better understanding right the way through. If I was a youngster right now, somewhere in the region, there are many careers that I might well not even know existed in space, in quantum computing, in autonomous vehicles, in bioscience that we've all heard a lot about recently. But if I was a young person coming through school or further education, it would be very difficult to truly understand what those careers are unless organizations reach out. So we will spend a lot of time on careers, work experience, days visiting major employers. If I'm an employer, the more I can be telling the educational establishments in my region what my likely demands are for employment. Am I looking for more engineers? Am I looking for more specialist technicians? Am I hoping that my universities are going to be able to recruit more academic staff to help my business in its research and development? The more that we can create that greater understanding of the potential, and particularly in a region like this, where we are sitting with so many technologies, industries, sectors that have got enormous growth potential. And what we should be doing is to try to make sure that nothing impedes that progress.
Thanks, Jeremy. Mike, bringing you in at this stage, obviously everyone's been talking about the Arc for some time now. It's a huge excitement. No one can argue against the potential opportunity, but give us your view in terms of how this is translating on the ground, in terms of is there a disconnect between sort of vision and reality, and what do you think the industry will be thinking about the ways that they can engage in the process moving forward?
There's definitely Arc fatigue, Chris. I think that's out there. That the NIC, and it's great to hear, Bev, the ramping up and the narrative developing. I think on the ground there's a degree of fatigue. We are seeing the resistance at local level. So I think Chris hit the nail on the head. I think the housing numbers are quite poisonous to the Arc narrative to start with. I think the narrative has changed towards economic. And with the economic growth comes the positives that we want. And with that, there's a more natural argument about housing. But the debate has been polarized a little bit. It'd be interesting to see the spatial work, because I think the discussions I've had with leaders along the Arc is there's a general acceptance of it. But where the big decisions are made along the East-West corridor and where we start to put substantial growth, that's when it gets quite interesting, isn't it? And it's when you get to the nub of making some difficult decisions locally that benefit the Arc regionally. that's where the disconnect is at the moment. But I think Bev and Jeremy and Chris, I think once that narrative is more understood, then we'll get the political support on the ground. But I think the messaging, the housing numbers, that million was quite dangerous and was a problem at the beginning.
I mean, this is a recurring theme. There's another question here from Nick Vose. I mean, sort of, again, maybe something, Chris, maybe just to touch up on just as we wrap up this first round. But how do you encapsulate the big idea and translate that into human scale benefits for communities? Contrast that to the justification of messaging for HS2, which changed constantly and impacted on confidence.
I mean, look, I mean, it's a really good question. There's lots of good questions in the chat. I think, you know, we have to be really clear on what we're trying to achieve, and I think rather than us kind of rushing to an answer, which is what we tended to do, and I think to a certain extent the NIC, when they talked about the million homes, they weren't necessarily saying that it was the million homes as the driver. They were just saying there was a risk that, you know, it's a sort of scale of growth that might be required. So I think we do have to get back to that sort of narrative on kind of the economy and then what that kind of unlocks for people. I think might put it quite well, and that requires us to actually engage with real people and see what they really want. You know, we've done some kind of pilot engagement to look at different approaches in which we can reach kind of groups that perhaps don't really engage in these types of conversations, and often young people. And some of the things that they're talking about are very much driven by the needs of the environment. And I know, speaking to the leaders, that they're really keen to focus on the green arc and how we can maximise the green arc potential, and that's a kind of point of difference. So I'm quite keen for us to kind of look at understanding those drivers and then trying to equate them to what they mean for real people in real areas, because the arc in itself is an economic construct rather than a sort of a regional construct that most people relate to, and of course there are kind of cities in the arc that are fast growing, and people kind of think about cities and counties first, so we're kind of conscious of that, but we do think it's the economy of scale of these things coming together that really unlocks its potential internationally. And I think it's that's where we need to be really sort of focusing our efforts, is not only is this already a kind of place of great innovation and great success because of the city that it has, and because of the work that's going in and around the areas, but we need to go much further, and to do that we have to get the kind of scale. And I think it's the collection of cities in the arc and the way of working and how rural comes into that really unlocks some of that. The other point I just wanted to raise, and there's a couple of questions in the chat, but I think the important thing here is, you know, that there are some things at regional scale that just won't be done through a local kind of planning authority or through kind of collaboration with local planning authorities, and where the government needs to take a much greater kind of interest, and one of those is water. You know, we're quite clear that some of the issues around water will stymie the growth opportunity in some parts of the area, and Cambridge is mentioned in the chat, and I think we have to come up with a proper plan for how we overcome that. You know, DEFRA, I and colleagues are working on some of these things at a national level, but we also need to make sure that we translate that on the ground locally, and so we will have to think through the kind of implications of that and what that water management system needs to look like for the arc for the long term, so that we're not doing sticky plaster solutions, but we're actually thinking about what are the long-term needs. And I think this process that we're embarking on will help us answer some of those questions, and I hope that then kind of leads into kind of how we think about how places change over time, because the real important point here is that you know, the area has grown. You know, we're not here because it isn't growing. It's a different scenario in other parts of the country. Here it's growing, and I would argue it's not growing optimally because it's not being planned for appropriately, and the scale of growth has outstripped perhaps what people thought might happen. But we still think there's more to come, and we want to kind of make sure that it's done in a planned way, and in a way that's sensitive to the needs of people, communities, and the environment.
Just Chris, just a follow-up, just in terms of what you were just saying, that probably some people will be thinking of is how will the government decide what needs to be dealt with at a government level and what can be devolved down to a local authority? I mean, just picking up on one of the specific questions that's coming from Nick Sanford, will the housing growth be driven by an overall numbers target, 1.25 million homes as previously mentioned, or will it be driven by what is environmentally sustainable in each area and ensuring that new residents have easy access to natural green space, etc.? I suppose it's what will be top down and what will be bottom up.
Yeah, I mean, there needs to be a way in which we come together. So a kind of top-down or bottom-up approach isn't necessarily the right answer. But I think we will have to take into account what the environment can sustain and what it can do so in a sustainable way. And I think, say, the onus will be much more on kind of understanding local plans as they come forward, understanding the kind of needs of those areas, and then trying to utilise the government's ability to then unlock some of that investment in a way that kind of local authorities and others have perhaps not been been as successful on. So we'll need to kind of think through how we do that. But there are some projects that are just too big to be done. So water is a good example where it needs a regional solution, and it will have a kind of local focus, but it needs regional investment, and it needs to be sort of thought about in a regional way. And that will be the same for lots of utilities and big transport infrastructure. But we can be sensitive to then how that plays and reaches into local communities, and that's what we'll need to do. And we haven't reached the answer on all of these things yet, and this is part of the reason why we want to go through this process and why we're working so collaboratively with local partners. But I do think there's something in some of the sub-regions of the Arc, and they sort of coincide with LEP geographies, is probably the right sort of scale to be thinking about some of that local stuff, and then taking it down a notch to the kind of local levels and sort of beneath that. So I think there's a bit of work to do, but that's why we're starting on this project, and it's a long-term project.
Just moving across onto the sort of the focus on deliveries. A couple of questions here from Nigel Hawkey and Nick Sanford, asking you to say something more about the possible use of development corporations, and would proposed development corporations have planning powers as did those in the new towns in the 1970s? If so, does this give rise to concerns about transparency in that DCs can both apply for planning permission and determine the applications?
Yeah, I mean, we're looking at all the options, and there's also kind of options for us to sort of amend some of the legislation if indeed it's required. But there is a rich history in this area of successful development corporations sort of delivering sort of great places, and Milton Keynes is a kind of case in point. And whilst not everyone agreed with it at the time, and over time there has been obviously some peaks and troughs in terms of performance and likability. But as a concept, Milton Keynes wouldn't exist had we not have done the things that we did. So I think there is some rich history there that we need to draw on, and obviously lots of people have experience of these. I mean, planning is obviously kind of one of the tools that kind of features, but let's not assume that doesn't require us to be really clear on what we're doing, and for us to engage with the local community that are directly impacted on these things. The idea here is that we want to be an exemplar approach to how we engage communities in what happens in their areas. This is not the same as a top-down approach by some people in Whitehall who are just going to do something and then walk away. We want to really embed this in the local area, and we'll set up kind of the right structures to ensure that integration happens locally, because that is the kind of one of the fundamental objectives of our program at the national level. And so we want to make sure that works locally. So we'll need to do some of that. We haven't reached any conclusions on exactly what formation or type or number of development corporations may be required. I could probably say that they won't be arc-wide, because I don't think that's necessary. But there are some sites that are tricky where a development corporation makes sense, and there are some sites where collaboration makes sense and different delivery vehicles make sense. But in all of this, we want to take a place-based approach, and each site will have its own opportunities, and we'll think about them from a site-by-site basis rather than have a sort of uniform way of acting on these sorts of things. But as I say, we've yet to make those decisions. We're looking at some of the evidence, we're talking to a lot of the local stakeholders, and no doubt when we get to a space where we need to consult, we'll do so in a way that engages people digitally as well as in person as necessary, and we'll make sure that we do all of that, because that's the commitment we've made, and it's something the Secretary of State feels strongly about.
So, Mike, just bringing you in on there, in terms of your sort of many years of experience in the industry, I mean, sort of any sort of pros or cons in your use of development corporations in the past, or anything that Kris and the government needs to take into account if it's going to adopt something similar as the delivery entity for the Arc moving forward? You need to unmute.
I've joined the club, Bev. You're not in isolation today. Resources. If you don't resource those development corporations, they'll be pointless, Kris. So if you're going to do it properly. So a properly resourced, well-funded development corporation will be an asset in getting things done. Just plucking a few people out locally and putting them in another body, asking them to do the same job they were doing elsewhere, is a recipe for failure.
Jeremy, can I just bring you back in? I mean, obviously, you're one of the co-signatories on the recent economic prospectus. How do you think that sort of will feed into the sort of engagement process? And is there any sort of anything that you particularly want to draw out whilst you've got Kris on the call at the moment in terms of specific acts on behalf of the LEPs?
Well, we have very good and very regular communication engagement with Kris. I mean, the prospectus was a way of showing just what the potential here is across the the region, both kind of internally, but also externally. I mean, we know right now, if you were a budding entrepreneur overseas somewhere and you were looking at where to take your idea or your patent or your small business, you will have choices. You will have choices as to whether you bring that idea or that business to the UK, elsewhere in Europe, to America, indeed to the Far East. And what we've got here in the region, we need to go on promoting internationally to the very best of our endeavours. So our universities coming together, and Kris referred to the way that the universities are collaborating to put their combined strength in research and development terms, their expertise, to put that across as well as we can. But the region's transport links, its connections, the natural geography we have got here and what we're passionate about retaining. So what we will be doing is continuing to promote the advantages it has. We've got clusters already. Those clusters of businesses, and all the evidence is that clusters of businesses really work in creating effective supply chains, in sharing knowledge, and so on. So we will go on promoting those clusters in some of the most successful emerging technologies. And as I was saying earlier, if you're a business, you look to a whole range of things before you choose to put your roots down in a particular area. And as you as property professionals will know only too well, it's a whole combination of things that will ultimately make you decide to initially establish yourself somewhere, or indeed to go on growing as you prosper in a particular area. And that's where the LEPs, as local organisations that can continue to help our local authority leaders to understand that on their own doorsteps, and for policies, for strategies to be aligned to that success. What everyone wants, whether they're bringing up families here or they're already in work here, they want to feel that the region has got economic strength at a time when many of our industries are going to be facing times of uncertainty. And the more we can do to help them understand areas where there is real opportunity here, that's what will bring the region alive. And it's what will actually ultimately contribute to national prosperity, not even just the region's prosperity.
Sharon, that's compelling. Just moving to onto a different subject, a question here, and sort of slight elephant in the room, and just in terms of, is it a concern that Bucks has tried to withdraw from the process? I mean, I've probably come to Kris and yourself, Bev, just in terms of trying to understand why do you think that they've opted out, and is this a problem for the long-term sort of success of the art moving forward? Let's come with you, Kris, and then follow up with yourself, Bev.
Yeah, so I think it's an important moment, and I think we're in a stage where we want to make sure that there's a consensus on the need to go forwards. We see the ARC, including Bucks and of course and taking the chunk out like that wouldn't really make sense from us from a kind of scale perspective. So we're kind of keen to continue to engage with the leadership of Bucks Council to make sure that they understand the kind of merits and the drivers for being engaged. And of course, in relation to the spatial framework, our policy. When we said we would do this in budget Bucks in budget 20, but Bucks was still part of that group, and so we think there's definite merit in kind of thinking and organising ourselves in this way. And they, of course, will be bringing forward a new local plan as part of the new unitary authority. So it's important that we engage with them, and important that they understand the potential here, and that some of this potential is kind of joint potential. And I'm sure that many of the businesses and organisations in Bucks will want to kind of play a part in what will be an internationally kind of renowned growth corridor. And I'd like to think we'll find a way to kind of work with them, irrespective of their kind of views. I think there's they're part of our wider family, and we need to make sure that they're included. Okay,
thanks. Bev, anything else that you'd want to add on that?
Yeah, Neil, just to be clear, the ARC leadership group that I represent, this is a coalition of the willing, and Buckinghamshire were very much a fundamental part of that, as was Bucks LEP, Buck University, with the ARC Universities group for some time. They just decided that it was in their best interest not to be part of that group anymore. But where the disagreement seems to be is that they felt they could take the geography with them. And clearly that's not what you're hearing from Kris, and will be the case. So we carry on treating, if you like, the landscape as part of an ARC, but we respect the fact that their sovereignty and their decision is to withdraw. Now, I think it's really, though, important, Neil, there's a couple of really important messages here that I think we need to pay attention to going forward. if anybody has any time to spare to look at the webinar we hosted last week on the economic prospectus, and if you don't have an hour or so to listen to it, listen to the last couple of minutes from Councillor Barry Wood, because what he was very clear in saying is, look, those of us that are still around the table, and that is the vast majority of local authorities, LEPs, and universities, is they want to be there to help guide and to help lead and to help shape this. They feel it's better to plan for than to be planned to, and they want to make sure they're positively engaging as much as they can. I think most of you in the development industry will have heard leaders speak like that. You'll have heard some others who see some of these things sometimes as a threat. I think the reality is, to them, it can be both. And the ones who are here are trying to make the best opportunity for this. But it will be absolutely paramount that we find a way to bring people with us in this process, because you've just seen an example how democracy can vote itself out of a conversation. And that's not really the helpful way to go forward. So if the collaboration is going to be successful, I hear exactly what Kris is saying. We need to move away from, this was never about a devolution deal. This was never about the ARC as a political entity. This was always about, can we get together and deliver things at scale that we couldn't otherwise deliver ourselves? And if we can continue to establish that value proposition, then I think the ARC will bring more people with it than lose. But the reality is, we need to engage better. We need to be clear about our narrative. We need to make sure those other things that people want for their communities, that strong sense of place, those planet changing shifts that the ARC can generate around climate change, etc., those need to come to the fore, and the growth will follow in a very clever and a very effective way after that. But I think it's a really good harbinger that if we're not careful, we can lose people in this process quite quickly. Thanks, Dave.
Just a quick reminder, everyone should have had it up on their screen, but obviously Ben's just set up the poll. So if everyone just wants to click in terms of what they think the long-term success of the ARC project would be best supported if, on the variety of options, we'll come back on the end to see where the priorities are coming out. I just want to pick up, obviously, the first webinar that Bidwell's held was looking at sort of the green credentials, and sort of further, Jeremy, I know that the webinar that was held last week was also sort of a strong focus on this being a green ARC. We've had a question submitted in advance of the webinar by Rick Parisi from Paragon, saying Cambridge Innovation Parks is a pipeline of around 500,000 square feet of new grade A office and leisure space. We have an absolute commitment to sustainability and to zero carbon construction. However, this comes at a significant cost. We're currently looking at circa £350 per square foot compared to the traditional build of 250. We can expect a small uplift in rental values due to our sustainability ethos, but valuers and funders do not give very much credit for this. As a result, it is very difficult to make the project financially viable, and there's a significant funding gap to be bridged. With each new build, we are pioneering new methodologies and materials in order to create a workable model. Sustainability is not going to be widely adopted unless it is financially viable. What assistance is going to be available, or where do you see this going in the coming years? And I suppose part of this is in terms of how, obviously, we've set very high aspirational level for sustainability, which is admirable. How does that get delivered? Is it regulation? Is it incentivization? Is it a mixture of the both? But how do you actually get this delivered on the ground when sort of the industry is telling you the difficulties and challenges that they've got?
Yeah, I mean,
bring everyone into this, but probably start with you, Kris, in the first instance around.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. I mean, look, it's a good question, and we have to sort of recognise the commercial viabilities of some of where we've got to. But I think we also have to sort of think about kind of what people really want, and ultimately, people will sort of vote with their feet. And I think over time, I think that the concept of net zero and how we deliver that, and how we sort of really sort of create the right incentive structures to make that a reality is kind of where we're going to be. And I think we should be as a country, and I think we have to make much more effort to kind of get there. Of course, there'll be kind of investment to support the innovation and the innovative potential of some of the new products and services as they come on board. But I think if we don't set ourselves a kind of a long-term agenda to kind of deliver this and make it a reality, then we'll always find excuses to not do it. And I think there's always tipping points. We're still quite early in the kind of in the delivery of some of these things, but we'd like to think that there's a way of doing that. I'd like to think that through the kind of spatial framework, we can have a really good discussion about what this means for delivery and the housing delivery, and kind of colleagues in Homes England who are our sort of delivery partners will be certainly thinking through some of the issues around sustainability. And I know they're doing quite a bit of work to kind of help make sure that make this a reality. And then we also have to have this long-term plan for really delivering on the environmental standards, and some of this isn't just about buildings, it's about transport, it's about kind of choices that people have about how they get to and from work, and we need to think of all of those sort of behavioural changes that are part of it. So it's not a simple answer, but if we don't start set that as our ambition, then we're never going to meet it. And you know, let's pick up a more detailed conversation on this, but we have to go in that direction.
Thanks. Jeremy, if I could come to you next, I mean, what systems do you think businesses might need, or what are businesses telling you that they need moving forward to try and deliver this high level of sustainability?
Well, I mean, we've actually got a lot of businesses in green technology, and for them, the ability to pilot, to trial on their own doorstep is exactly what they need to see continuing government investment into research and development in some of these areas. But I mean, we already have in PV, in hydrogen, in battery, in fusion. We've across the arc emerging technologies which increasingly we're hearing government pay more and more attention to. And I think as we saw from the Prime Minister's announcement last week, where the recognition that these are, again, technologies that will not benefit at all as residents, but become technologies to generate economic prosperity for us going forward. And far better those technologies are developed here in the UK, and I would say here across this region, than elsewhere. And so what we're doing, and you asked about the prospectus, that again was one way of highlighting some of those. We will go on highlighting those, helping businesses to make their own investment case to government, where there is gap funding needed, or where there's a backbone of infrastructure, as Kris has referred to. I think something like the East West Railway, you know, I think we would all wish to see firm commitment for some of the most important pieces of capital infrastructure, which only ultimately government can commit to. Without getting into detail this morning, I suspect that many of us would have views about local transport improvements that, again, are part and parcel of continuing to make this region as attractive as it possibly can be, from a current employment, from a future employment point of view. And that's where we're focused. We're focused about creating the employment, sustaining the employment, making it as attractive a place as it can be into the medium term. As Kris has said, these may be difficult decisions for investment today, but you will see individuals making choices over time. And it's continuing to make this region a place where it's a first choice for somebody to come and live, or continue to live, or continue to develop their business.
Thanks, Jeremy. Bev, anything that you want to come in on that?
Just to wholly endorse exactly what Jeremy just said. And I think one of the things, I don't know that particular site specifically, Neil, but I think one of the things that we've got to recognize is we also don't end up at carbon zero in one go. You know, we don't show up on January 1st, 2051 and suddenly go, the world has changed. We need to incrementally grow. We need to incrementally improve. And I think working at scale and working across the arc, a geography like the arc, means we have an opportunity to be able to develop technologies and roll out things at scale that actually will make these things more viable. But we also have the ability to test each other and to challenge each other to raise the bar. And I must admit, I've been dead impressed with the way the development community have brought forward conversations about net gain. And we're seeing real examples on the ground of where that's happening. And I think that's the kind of momentum, once we get that scale going, that we will succeed and go further. You know, if I can, just one real quick comment. Somebody else raised it in the chat bar. I want to make it absolutely clear, and it goes back to the point, actually, I think it's back to the viability point. We do respect the fact that an organization like Bucks Council decides it wants out of this conversation as a party to the ARC leadership group. But make no mistake, that is not anybody is making a decision for them. That is their decision. The power, ultimately, though, the democratic accountability, I do think sits with government. And I think the words you heard from Kris today is that leadership role that the government will play in taking this forward. And I think that includes the viability argument. You know, those announcements that Jeremy said from the PM will drive innovation. They will drive commercialization. That's where we need to go to confidently, and the sooner the better, because we can start to actually address these things in a very proactive and positive way for everybody across the arc. And indeed, I think the spread will be across the UK. Thanks, Nick.
Thanks, Bev. Mike, finally, I mean, anything to add in terms of, do you think there's serious challenges on viability pressures in terms of trying to deliver the aspirations that are currently being set out by the ARC?
Yeah, it's the easiest way to deal with this and the cleanest way to deal is to create a level playing field and legislate so there's a clear incentive through the building regs rather than through planning policy to try and encourage a developer to spend more on a product when he doesn't get a return on it. Probably isn't the right way to do it. Level up and incentivize the greening of buildings through the building regs, through the tax system. We have some perverse tax breaks at the moment for demolishing buildings and renovating buildings. So I don't know, the discussion may be going on now, Kris, with the Chancellor. He may be creating a solution as we're speaking, Neil, but there needs to be clear incentives for this greening. We have some perverse incentives at the moment for demolishing buildings with VAT exemptions, rather than the exemption possibly going on reaching BREEAM outstanding or something with a tangible target. So for me, it's about regulation rather than encouragement.
Brilliant. Thanks, Mike. Just picking up in terms of the poll that Ben set out earlier, there's sort of quite close between several of the responses, and actually we've had some comments back into saying actually the set responses missed out probably quite a key one in terms of the general public and their engagement in that. Very clearly, sort of what seems to be coming out on top was that sort of what the long-term success of the arc will be best supported if local authorities and LEPs collaborated more closely around their shared ambitions, but closely followed by business leaders were more involved in the creation of arc-wide growth strategies, and central government had greater powers over major arc planning decisions. We've touched on those over the course of that, and I'm conscious of the time, and unfortunately we won't be able to get to all of the questions that have been asked, but we've taken a note of them all, and we'll try and come back to people outside of the webinar. But I think it's coming back to the central sort of premise in terms of have we got the right balance between sort of government vision and local policy making to enable us to be able to deliver at the pace that we need. Kris, what's your thoughts as a sort of summing up what are the key steps moving forward for you?
Yeah, we definitely haven't got the right balance yet, but I think the intention is to find that right balance, and collaborating in the way that we want to will help us do some of that. And I'll sort of stress again that we really do want to bring people with us, and this is kind of doing it in a patient and sensitive way so that we can engage in that debate. And we want to do that in a way that's transparent so that people can see exactly what the general public, businesses, communities are kind of saying about what they would like. Because often I think it's misrepresented, and the kind of a small minority kind of drive a debate that isn't represented of the majority, and I think that's an important kind of factor that we need to kind of ensure that we kind of bring in. I think just picking up on that, you know, there is something we haven't said actually, which I think is probably quite important, which is around the expressway. And I just want to sort of say that you know, unless it's changed overnight, I'm assuming that, you know, the policy itself is paused as kind of the department takes on the views of many local people that have expressed their views, and they're considering kind of what to do next, and that's the current policy. I think there are some questions about the viability from a sustainable transport perspective on a road of that nature, but equally there are lots of sort of needs for connectivity in the area, and one of the key findings of the NIC work was that east-west connectivity is really poor, and this was one of those solutions, and so that there'll be more that's said on that in the kind of coming weeks and months, but I think it's important to stress. And I'll kind of sum up by saying, you know, not all places in the arc are equal. There are some places that are doing really well, and even in some of the places like Cambridge that have done quite well sort of over the past kind of 20 years, that there's massive inequality, and levelling up isn't just about kind of other parts of the country, it's also within regions, and that's where the biggest differences are. So we need to have a really good crack at doing this properly, and we see this as an economic project with a central economic business case that underpins it, and a series of projects that really kind of will help drive this growth in the long term. And we want to do that collaboratively. As I've said, we want to work with partners to bring forward schemes and initiatives, and we want to work with industry to make sure we're doing the right things. And we'll, you know, we want to engage in the debate, and sort of Mike's last point on regulation, you know, let's use the kind of process that we're creating for this to start to have a discussion about what's really required to deliver on our ambitions, and let's not leave any stone unturned, to quote Lord Heseltine, because I think that's what we need to do to make sure this works for everybody.
Thanks, Kris. Just clarifying that comment you just made on the expressway, so pause but not abandon. This is clearly something that will be picked up as part of the ongoing engagement over the coming months and year ahead.
It's paused, and that's the current sort of position, and then a group of people over the next kind of coming weeks and months will kind of decide exactly what we do next. So at the minute it's paused as a project as people reflect on the advice and input that we've received from local communities.
Okay, thanks, Kris. Jeremy, any final thoughts in terms of we've got the balance right, and anything that you'd like to see on behalf of the LEPs moving forward?
Well, I think as Kris says, we're very conscious that we need to go on looking at where the balance is right. I mean, I'd put it like this. if we were a region that we thought had as much potential as we do, but we knew that we needed government's attention, we'd be shouting to gain that attention. We've got that government's attention. And so the more we all collaborate, the more we all put our own issues, concerns, objectives on the table, the more successful this region will be. So those in the chat that are saying, or indeed if the poll comes out saying they would like to be more involved, then bring it on. Please do get involved, because the better we all understand the issues and the opportunities, the more successful we'll make this region.
Thanks, Jeremy. Bev, any final thoughts from yourself?
Really tough to follow Jeremy all the time. He takes all my words away, Neil. No, I just exactly that we need to keep talking. We need to keep engaging. I mean, this is a really interesting forum for us to be engaging in, which we've not been engaging with this particular sector well. Clearly, the environment sector is an area where we need to do more engagement work. We need to get people believing that we can actually start to make some change. I saw somebody in your chat bar said we need some humility. Trust me, there's a lot of people who are not happy with what we're doing now, and we are using this opportunity that Jeremy just highlighted as an opportunity to change that narrative. So I think that engagement is our key challenge over the next few months, to keep working together, build things together, and see what we actually can achieve in a collective way. I think Jeremy's absolutely right. The government have given us a spotlight. Let's take advantage of that to our communities and to our residents, to our businesses' advantage. Cheers.
Thanks, Bev. Mike, you've got the sort of the last opportunity in terms of hearing everything and picking up on your initial comment, just in terms of the potential for ARC fatigue already. Obviously, lots of discussions ongoing, more to come. How do we keep the energy in that and everyone focused and sort of feeding into the process in a positive way?
Two things, Chris. One is pace. You said that at the beginning. I think the industry needs to see evidence of that. We will not be able to please all the people. That is a fact. There are some tough decisions that need to be taken, but we've all benefited from 800 years of legacy. I think, Bev, you mentioned legacy, that through investment for others, we have to do the same for the next generation of people, or in the legacy we're currently leaving isn't one to envy, is it? I think that does require development. We're building less houses now than we did in 1972 for much bigger populations. And the final point for me is the pandemic has taught us that we can engage. And what we've experienced with large planning applications, digital engagement has embraced a younger, different demographic, which has put a different spin on development. Traditional models in 2019 were pretty predictable in terms of their outcomes. It's been very refreshing in terms of digital engagement. That's something you're very keen on. But that doesn't need to hang. That can be done at pace, Chris. And if you're going to do these things, please do them at pace, because I think we're having this seminar this time next year and the spatial plan hasn't come out and there's some big blobs and we're having a sensible discussion. I think fatigue will turn into investment looking elsewhere.
Thanks very much, Mike. I'm conscious that we're just pretty much running out of time. So if I just take the opportunity of thanking all of our guests and panelists this afternoon, Kris, Jeremy, Bev, Mike, thanks very much for your contributions. I think it's been really interesting, and hopefully everyone who's joined has found it an engaging debate. Thanks very much for everyone who has been able to join us, and Ben for helping out behind the scenes. I think just leave it to say, hopefully you will be able to join us in the new year for our third and final webinar, where we'll be focusing on academia and sciences. That's on the 14th of January at 12 o'clock. Bidwell's going to be co-hosting that webinar with the ARCS Universities group, and we'll be joined by Sir Peter Gregson. I think that session will be looking at how universities and science and tech are working together in transformational projects across the ARC. We'll consider how the science and tech companies in the ARC can ensure they attract the best talent from top universities to enable this sector to flourish. So it's sort of quite a good way to finish the series. Thanks everyone for joining. Apologies we weren't able to get through all the questions, but we've taken a record of them and we'll try and come back to people outside of this. Please carry on the debate on LinkedIn and get in touch if there's anything else that you want to speak to us about. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.